The next speaker is Golda S. Benjamin. She is the program director with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Golda joined the Business and Human Rights Resource Center in March 2017 as the Southeast Asia researcher and representative. Golda also teaches law and runs a solo practice law firm focusing on development policy reform and commercial arbitration. Prior to her time at the Resource Center, she served as one of the civil society representatives in the Philippines Multi-Sectoral Group for Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. She also served as chief for legislation of a senator of the Republic of the Philippines and supervised the development of various laws. So she would be able to tell us what are the laws that needs to be reformed, the reforms that is required. Golda's alternative law practice began at Ideals Incorporated Philippines, where she focused on agrarian reform, tax justice, environment and trade issues, handling litigation, advocacy, and policy reform. Golda has a Bachelor's of Science degree in psychology and a Bachelor of Laws from the University of the Philippines. For those of you from abroad, the UP or the University of Philippines has got the premier law school in the whole of Philippines. She also has a master's degree with specialization in international commercial arbitration. Golda, over to you.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone from the Philippines. What an incredible webinar with almost 200 participants and counting. So I was asked to give a brief overview on the conditions in Asia, specifically in the garment sector. So I'm going to relate some of the stories and some of what we are doing, hoping that in giving rise or amplifying all these trends and allegations that we're seeing in the sector, that we also can find ways of working together to elevate campaigns and find ways to extract more accountability from businesses. So ever since the conditions on the impact of COVID-19 became more and more serious, we started tracking the responses of businesses and corporations around the world. And specifically for the garment sector, we looked at the 33 biggest multinational garment companies, and we now have a developing and growing COVID-19 apparel action tracker. And the purpose of this initiative really is to look at how brands are responding to the crisis and how these responses are affecting the workers down the line. So some of the worrying trends that we're seeing is that a lot of companies, of course, have refused to pay their workers or have requested, for example, for discounts in their pending orders, which in turn affect the ability of their suppliers to also pay their workers in the host countries. There are also some positive trends wherein apparel companies have extended payment times for their suppliers and have also supported their suppliers in terms of accessing financial subsidies so that they can continue operating and they don't have to dismiss a lot of their workers on the ground. We also see a lot of the trend that despite the economic difficulty and the pressure and the suffering of workers around the region, that many companies still continue to pay shareholder dividends. And this is something that we should all be looking at because this is really a time for shared pain according to many who have articulated the responsibility of businesses. For the more responsible businesses, many of them have paid both their existing orders and their contracted orders, even if production has not started, and that's a positive development. Some companies have also chosen to set up mechanisms for grievances, which is positive because the feedback is immediate and there's a way for these multinational companies to liaise with their suppliers and then also with their workers. And also, more responsible businesses have come forward to actually support calls directed to governments in terms of providing safety and better working conditions, safe repatriation, ensuring wage payments of especially the migrant workers. But the trends continue to be worrying. we have also started. So we are tracking the responses of businesses, of the garment companies in Asia. And we are also starting to look at specific countries. What are the calls of certain country organizations, whether these are labor organizations, migrants organizations, what calls have been raised already, and how are governments and businesses responding to these calls. And from this latest tracking and survey that we had, we realized and we discovered that in 7 of the 10 countries that we're currently looking at very closely, there is really a lack of COVID-19 safety precautions in garments factories. So we see that all over Asia. And another disturbing trend is that in 4 of the 10 countries in our country trackers, garment worker protests over unpaid wages have been met with violent crackdowns. So we have seen and have responded to reports from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from Myanmar, and from the Philippines. Of course, very important is for businesses right now to really respect the exercise of the freedoms of association and assembly, but we're not seeing very positive trends on that area. We're looking at we recently released a union busting brief looking at the behavior and the responses of 9 apparel companies. And despite the fact that we only looked at 9, we found out that almost 5,000 union workers have been sacked. And there is evidence to point that their dismissals were also partly due to the fact that they are union members. And despite many pressures from different organizations, there are still 6 major unresolved cases involving very big factories with thousands of workers. Now, it's important also to look at how companies are responding and compare this also with their publicly disclosed policies. This is an entry point, especially like for us for the Resource Center, when we write the companies to respond to allegations of abuse, we do point out on many occasions their publicly disclosed policies on, for example, workers' rights, grievance mechanisms, and the like. But unfortunately, many companies have chosen any of these responses. Number one, many of them still choose not to engage or not to respond to allegations of abuse, despite repeated outreach from us and other organizations. Other companies also operate with very limited transparency and accountability, just simply giving us broad strokes answers like they're looking into it, but never really giving us feedback as to the result of their investigations. Of course, obviously, there is a big gap in many of the company brand policy commitments versus factory implementation. And we have done a lot of work on this because we work closely with unions in various countries in Asia. So every time we get a response about from brands saying that, oh, they have this policy in favor of protection of human rights, or they are protecting as a policy, they are protecting workers right now. It's easier now for us to get feedback and reach out to the unions and the workers organizations all across Asia to really check if factory implementation is consistent with brand policies. And we have recently strengthened also another mechanism to our company response mechanism explained by Izzy a while ago, and that is the process of rejoinders, meaning as soon as we get a response from the brand or for the garment company, we also ask and invite the unions and the workers associations to send the rejoiners, just so that there will be like a cross-checking of the claims of the brands, pushing corporate accountability more and more, especially in this difficult time. Of course, there's also the usual defense of the company when they defer to local labor laws that fall short of international standards. We see this a lot on the wage theft issue, on the minimum wage issue, and even on freedom of association issues. Many companies always phrase their responses and say that They are respectful of country legislation or the legislation that bind their factories, and thus they can only do so much. Of course, we know that this is not enough, that we have to continuously push the multinational companies to go beyond often labor laws that are really way below international standards. Of course, there's also the non-transparent dialogue with suppliers. We don't know what comes out of these dialogues, so it's important that we continue the push and outreach also to the companies, getting a lot of verifiable information from the workers themselves all across Asia or wherever you are operating in your own respective jurisdictions or your work. And finally, this we really need and we continue to track the commitment of companies to really resolve the issues on the ground, even if it's wage theft or it is a violation of freedom of associations of the workers. There are still a lot of unresolved cases, and that's why campaigns have to be strengthened, and we need to continue supporting each other. Uh, from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, we can help by doing company outreach and generating as much evidence. We continue to track the responses of governments and companies, and with a hope also that this will be useful to campaign organizations and movements around the world, so that our outreach also to companies and our push for government legislation reform will be evidence-based. So for my first intervention, I'd like to limit those to my discussion of the trends and what have been the responses of the companies, and would be happy to also get back and discuss more on some of the calls that we have gathered from various organizations around the region. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Golda, for your perspective on the garment sector, as well as the rising trends in Asia regarding the challenges faced by workers generally and migrant workers. You've also thank you also for giving us the responses that you've got from governments as well as from the businesses, and for highlighting the gaps that exist in the securing of migrant workers' rights, the issues that arise from wage theft, the issues that arise from the denial of the freedom of association, and so on. These are very serious issues, and we will continue the discussion later.